So today we're going to talk about custom sportswear. So factory to field, is Vietnam leading? Time goes on, sports becomes more and more popular, and there are clubs that are playing and competing against each other. And when they play, they like to have uniforms, and on the uniforms they have their names and their numbers. Where is the best place in the globe to produce custom sportswear? Anybody in the audience produce sportswear? How about anybody play sports? Sir, what sports do you play? Baseball? Cycling? Out of the three, baseball would be the one where the uniforms have the names and the numbers on. It's producing baseball, hockey, volleyball, any of the team sports where the players have their own unique uniforms. The question is, where's the best place to produce? Well, first, let's just define again custom sportswear. We talked about a little bit, but you've got two segments. You've got the professional sports, where the players are getting paid millions of dollars to play, and their jerseys are using the best quality fabrics, best stitching, best embellishing, whether it's printing or embroidery. But then you also have another very big segment, which is the amateur sports teams, from kids to teenagers. Both are very big business opportunities around the world to serve these sports teams. And obviously the premium market, the price for the fabric and the stitching will be higher. But for the amateur market, the price point is really tight because it's usually the parents that are buying the jerseys. They're always looking for a good deal. From a population and wages perspective, where's the best place to produce custom sportswear on the globe? And here we have a list of countries, manufacturing countries that have populations, competitive labor cost. And at the top is India and China. Both countries have 1.4 billion people. Then it's Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria, all the way down to the 9th position, Vietnam, which is where I live and work. Just based on this list, the conclusion would be that India and or China would be a great place to produce custom sportswear. I would argue China's best, but if China's not an option for you, then India's a very close second. So let's look at minimum wage by country. So here you see Myanmar and Nigeria on the global scale have the lowest minimum wage. And then India is number 5 position, and Vietnam number 7. You could logically conclude that Myanmar is a great place to produce custom sportswear as long as they have the population and they have good competitive labor costs. So if you can set up a factory in Myanmar, that could be a very good place to produce custom sportswear. Taking both into account, I'm going to suggest that based on these two factors, the best place to produce custom teamwear, custom sportswear is in India, because they have a lot of people and they have very competitive labor costs. So based on culture, where is the best place to produce custom sportswear? Let's take India, for example. India, a big part of their culture is the caste system, which can be problematic because if a young person who's very skilled and ambitious wants to rise up the ranks of a factory to help the factory's bottom line, it's a bit problematic because of the caste system. The way the system is set up is that there's very little upward mobility. This can be a challenge in India because of their culture. Or here's a headline that reads, "Production in Bangladesh, Overcoming Operational Challenges." Perhaps what they're talking about is the fact that 80% of Bangladeshis are Sunni Muslims, and according to the Sunni Muslim religion, you have the right to pray 5 times a day, which can be problematic for a factory owner if the workers not only get their regular bathroom breaks, but also get prayer breaks. Bangladesh has its cultural challenges, even though Bangladesh has a large population and a very competitive labor cost. Now, Vietnam, where I have been working for the last 14 years, I work in the apparel business there. After about 3 years, I asked myself, why do I feel so comfortable in Vietnam? And a lot of my customers also, when they come to Vietnam and as they're leaving, they make the comment that they're looking forward to coming back. Why is that from a cultural perspective? And it wasn't until I was looking at some government documents and I saw the three words independence, freedom, and happiness as the country's slogan. The country shares the same values that I was raised with in America. I can attest to the Vietnamese people also truly value freedom, independence, and happiness. I see the government supporting the lower class, the middle class, and the upper class to all have a chance to achieve independence, freedom, and happiness. One of the strengths of Vietnam is its culture. Then the last three examples we just gave are what I call macro cultural analysis. But we also have to take into account the micro culture because every factory is unique. Let's take the example of India. Sure, they have the caste system, and that can be a challenge. If you have different factory workers from different castes, that can cause conflict. But there might be an Indian business owner that makes a decision to only hire people within a certain caste so that everybody within that factory is in the same caste and they're all on equal grounds and they work well together. This is an example of a factory in Vietnam called Thanh Cam. You can see they've got their own vision and mission. They have their own microculture. It's a great factory. Sure, there's macro culture. You also have to take into account the microculture and how does that microculture complement your culture. I would just say that in Vietnam, there's more needles and they're easier to find. Where's the best place to produce custom sportswear, teamwear, from the perspective of taxes? Because the governments, they all want a piece of the business. So here is a complicated diagram of free trade agreement relations, specifically with Vietnam. You can see Vietnam in the middle. So for example, Vietnam has a specific free trade agreement with Japan. Anybody in Japan who produces teamwear in Vietnam will have to pay a particular tax. So it's country specific. All of Europe has a free trade agreement with Vietnam. The taxes for custom sportswear will be unique if you're producing in Vietnam and then shipping into a European Union country. So it's case by case. It's hard to say that one country is better than another for producing custom sportswear just based on import taxes. The Olympics just happened and the American basketball team played in the Olympics, and of course they had to have their custom teamwear. If you produce custom teamwear made with 100% polyester fabric in China and then ship it into the USA, you have to pay a 32% duty. That's just standard. Plus, thanks to the Trump tax, you have to pay an additional 25%. This is problematic because that's a lot of money that you have to pay on top of the factory price. In the case of if you're in the custom sportswear business in America, it doesn't make sense to produce in China from a tax perspective. Where's the best place to produce custom teamwear on the globe, taking into account access to fabric, trims, and accessories? So here's a picture of a very large textile factory in China. And I think it's a foregone conclusion that China is the best when it comes to raw materials. I did some research online. I was able to find some data for yarn fabric export values. In 2023, China exported $134 billion worth of fabric, whereas India only exported $12 billion worth of fiber, yarn, and fabric. China is clearly the leader when it comes to raw materials. And since you need fabric, it makes sense to set up your manufacturing either in China or, if China is not an option, very close to China, which is where Vietnam has an advantage. Vietnam has very strong bilateral trade with China, aside from the fact that they're close and it's fast. You can get materials in quickly. Vietnam imports $110 billion worth of stuff from China. They export $61 billion worth of stuff to China, which is impressive. They're number 6 in all of Asia in terms of the amount of importing that they do from China, and they're number 4 in all of Asia for the amount of goods that Vietnam exports to China. China and Vietnam have a long love-hate relationship, a long history, but I would say they're more friends than enemies because they do a lot of business together and both sides have a lot of benefit. They're great trading partners. We talked about people and wages, we talked about culture, taxes, and raw materials. Will Vietnam lead moving into the future? Vietnam is modernized. It has a young population that's excited about the future, and a lot of small, medium enterprises that are growing up and improving every day and offering great manufacturing services, as well as some very large corporations that are making for Nike and Under Armour and all the big brands. But this custom teamwear is more of a small, medium enterprise business model, because there are business people that are serving all the local teams and clubs all around the world. So this presentation isn't so much for the large brands like Nike, Under Armour, and Adidas and Puma. So what does it take to be able to serve the custom teamwear industry? One big part is sublimation printing. And Vietnam, 14 years ago, when I got to Vietnam, there was almost no sublimation printing, custom teamwear manufacturing happened. And I've watched over the last 14 years as more and more digital printers popped up. The calendar sellers were selling the calendars into Vietnam. And now, now laser printing is coming of age. Vietnam is now strong when it comes to sublimation printing, which is very important for custom teamwear. You also need to be able to buy ink. Vietnam does not manufacture ink. China and Japan do, and it's very easy for Vietnam to buy ink locally or get it imported from China and Japan. And all the major brands have local reps that are selling their inks locally. You also need paper. Vietnam can get paper locally from wholesalers that have already imported it and stocked it, or they can buy it directly from Japan, China, and Indonesia. And you can get, there's high, medium, and low quality paper. It's all readily available, and you can just buy by the roll, and you can get it within 24 hours. And the paper is used in the transferring process in sublimation printing. When it comes to the printers themselves, Vietnam does not manufacture these large format digital printers, but you can buy them from China or Japan. All the major brands like Homer, Roland, 𝗰𝗂𝘀𝘁cie, they all have service reps and sales offices in Vietnam ready to both sell new machines and, importantly, to service them. If you have a problem with the machine, there are service reps readily available in Vietnam that can be on site within less than 12 hours to help fix the machine. One big challenge with these digital printers is the print heads. And now there's a of spare print heads in case you need to fix them to keep the machine running. 10 years ago, that didn't exist, but it does now. 80% of the garments that are made in Vietnam are using fabric that's imported from outside of Vietnam. But Vietnam does have a lot of local fabric production. For example, 𝗰𝗂𝘀𝘀𝘁 𝗰𝗂𝘀𝘀𝘁 and king-hoa is a Vietnamese manufacturer. This is Korean, Taiwanese, and Taiwanese. And they make world-class fabrics locally in Vietnam. It's still cheaper in many cases to import fabric from China than it is to buy the fabric in Vietnam. And the main reason is that most of these fabric mills, they're booked months in advance by the major brands. And they only have maybe 10 or 20% spare capacity, which they're more than happy to sell to people who walk in the door and want to do small quantity, but they charge a high price, and there's a long lead time relative to the price that you can get out of China and how quickly you can get fabric from China. Lastly is sewing. There are thousands of small workshops and medium-sized sewing factories. These four in particular focus on teamwear. You have Saigon Printer, Game Day Apparel, 𝗁𝗶𝗲𝗁, and Ao Thun have their own in-house sewing, and in some cases they have in-house printing, and they're more than happy to help you produce your custom sportswear or teamwear in Vietnam.